When you talk about the best video games of all time, Resident Evil 4 almost always comes up. While there's a good chunk of RE fans that believe 2 is still the best, or hold a bit of spite because this was a major turning point for the gameplay of the franchise, the people out there that flat out don't like this title are extremely few and far between. With it creeping up on its 15-year anniversary, I wanted to take a look back and see how it holds up today, and since I never know how to get these things started, let's just get into it. Quick history lesson. Resident Evil 4 began development back in 1999 for the PlayStation 2. The original plans were scrapped as they thought it strayed too far from the Resident Evil name, even though they knew they wanted more of an action-based title. This scrap plan later turned into the Devil May Cry franchise. Towards the end of 2001, the project was picked back up, and around a year later it was announced that it would be an exclusive for the Nintendo GameCube, which people weren't too happy about. Eventually a few gameplay videos came out, and while the game looked scary and innovative, fans were a little worried about Leon being in more of a paranormal setting over the familiar zombie apocalypse. Both the Fog and Hookman versions, as they've become known by, were scrapped altogether too. While this was going on, Resident Evil 0 and the Resident Evil remake were both released for the GameCube. Both did very well with critics and fans, especially the remake, but were considered somewhat of financial flops due to a lack of sales. Despite those positive reviews, the development team was said to be getting bored with doing the same scenarios and decided Resident Evil 4 needed to literally be reinvented. Once again, fans were getting a little nervous. Two mediocre action movies based off of the games had come out as cash grabs, as well as a few other non-mainline games that were also mediocre at best. Fans then learned the game did go with the original plan and changed back to more of an action feel, and learned that there wouldn't even be any more zombies. People started to lose faith and think the franchise was about to jump the shark, but those worries would be completely erased in January of 2005. Or at least they would be for GameCube owners. PS2 owners, who also outnumbered GameCube owners by more than 5 to 1, had to impatiently wait until October to get their port. Right off the bat, this has a very different feel than any other Resident Evil game. Gone were the tight corridors and cramped urban streets that gave players that claustrophobic sense of dread. Instead, we got a much more open, out-in-the-wilderness environment. And as we soon found out, this much space was very necessary because also gone were the days when you rarely saw more than a couple enemies on screen. Those enemies were no longer zombies, but rather humans that were infected with a parasite that lets the main antagonist mind control them. This replaces the animalistic aggression of the zombies with a weirdly more thought out, still somewhat human violence. Resident Evil 4 gives you a handful of these new enemies to get the gameplay mechanics down, then throws you right into the fire. The initial village sequence to this day is still known as one of the best openings in video games. Instead of zombies lumbering down and making telegraphed lunges, the Ganados introduced a much different experience. They carried knives and pitchforks, threw axes at you, and holy shit, they ran towards you. To counter this, Leon got a hell of an upgrade too. The knife can be almost game-breaking, new melee kicks and suplexes deal heavy damage to stunned opponents, and an improved quick turn feature leveled the playing field. Instead of having just the down, middle, and up angles, players got a laser sight that let them aim wherever they wanted to. Taking out knees and stunning with headshots were vital, as large groups of Ganados close in on Leon quickly. The first time I played this, I can't tell you how many times I died during the village encounter. You've got limited ammo and a ton of enemies. What has the Resident Evil franchise taught you thus far? You make your shots count, you kill when you need to, and you run when you can. Well, in this sequence, the more you run, the more enemies come at you. Kill the first few in the middle, and you'll have more enemies spawn from the paths around you. Go into the house for cover? Well, that spawns a few more, including one with a chainsaw. Most people learned the hard way that this enemy, known as Dr. Salvador, also came with a one-hit kill whenever they got too close. Sure, Resident Evil 2 didn't wait too long to throw the first liquor at you, but a one-hit kill enemy within the first 10 minutes of the game? That was a dick move back in 2005. But it isn't unfair. The reason the game won't spawn Dr. Salvador unless you go in the house is because that's where the shotgun is. You're really just trying to stay alive long enough for a quick cutscene and a snarky line from Leon to play out, and then the title screen pops up. This was all nothing more than the damn intro to the game. It was their way of telling players that this wasn't going to be your typical Resident Evil experience. For the first and second chapters of the game, you explore deeper into the decrepit village. Meanwhile, you also get introduced to some of the villains, a guy named Luis that Leon keeps calling Lewis, and the shrieking annoyance that is Ashley. Now, the voice acting is actually pretty good for 2005, but the dialogue is completely awful, something I'll get into more later.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
You're right. I get it. You've seen that clip. We've all seen that clip. The script is fucking bad, alright? Anyway, as you explore the rest of the village, you get introduced to even more enemy attacks. Ganados will come armed with dynamite, bear and wire traps litter the ground, and you'll get very accustomed to button mashing and quick time events from sneak attacks. While it's all very different from previous Resident Evil games, it's not until the third chapter that Resident Evil 4 really starts getting ridiculous. That's when we get introduced to the castle portion of the game. This is where the game bears basically no resemblance to anything in the franchise thus far. Enemies now wear robes, masks, carry shields, maces, crossbows, and even the occasional rocket launcher. The main baddie of this portion is a childlike, Napoleon-esque character named Salazar. You'll encounter sentient suits of armor that sometimes have enemies within, sometimes just attack and fall apart. You'll fight Garradoirs, which are basically Wolverine if he was from Silent Hill instead of Marvel, and hordes of invisible bug monsters that Leon loves to kick out of the air. But really, the castle in itself is almost a character. You'll go from the sewers that feel like they would fit in any prior Resident Evil game to randomly hitting a room that's basically Mount Doom in Mordor in rapid succession. They throw in a not-so-maze-like hedge maze and even an appearance from Ada. The whole castle level just really goes off the rails a bit, and it's fucking awesome. They kinda work you into realizing this is an action game first and a horror game second. This way you've already been lulled into the crazy aspects before it goes full-blown, alright, what the hell, I'm being chased by a massive statue of a guy that says he's only like 20 years old, but who built this? It doesn't matter how ridiculous it is, it's fun. The game itself doesn't take itself seriously. The castle starts off with cultists catapulting exploding boulders at Leon, and that's actually one of the more tame parts of the level. It's meant to be over the top, and it's just fun. The fifth and final chapter takes us to the island, which is basically just a shantytown military base that hides the main lab where the Plagas experiments were done. Even with some of the weapon upgrades you'll now have, enemies are noticeably more difficult, but also seem the most human, which does kinda take you a little out of the experience in a weird way. Ganados now carry cattle prods, miniguns, and Legion of Doom rip-off armor. This section isn't as good as the prior chapters, and does drag on a little bit, but still doesn't feel less fun, if that oxymoron statement makes any sense. I think it's a combination of two things. As I said, fighting guys in shoulder spikes and gas masks does feel off, but it's likely more the runtime. By Resident Evil standards, this is a long game, and I don't know, maybe I'm just ready for it to be done, but the island does seem longer than the previous locations, despite only being one chapter. But back to the positives. One enemy that is introduced here is quite possibly the scariest, or at least probably the creepiest in the whole franchise, and that's of course the Regenerators. They can only be killed by blasting away Plagas visible with the infrared scope, which of course you don't have upon meeting the first couple, or just dealing a ton of damage. By this point in the game, you're very comfortable just shooting everything in the face and calling it a day, but these guys change the rules. Shoot it in the face, it'll regrow that face, still swinging at you at the top of its head. Shoot off a leg and run by? I think we all shit our collective pants when we tried that, and it still lunges off the ground at your neck. Even their basic movements are creepy. The worst though is their breathing and the noises they still make. Nothing in this game comes close to making you stop dead in your tracks when you hear it. Once you make your way to the end, the island finishes up with several boss fights. First you get a fight with U3, who Sadler simply calls It, a lengthy battle with Krauser, and then polished off with the big baddie Sadler himself. Finally we get a kind of annoying jet ski escape sequence, which in my opinion probably should have just been a cutscene, but that's followed by Leon shooting down Ashley, only to then get shot down by Hunnigan, and roll credits. When it's done, you get a ton of unlocked content, including a much improved version of the Mercenaries minigame, the Separate Ways, as well as Assignment Ada stories, and the New Game Plus feature, which is what all this footage is from. New Game Plus carries over upgrades, weapons, and ammo, so it really lets you fly through the game guns blazing. Mercenaries is a fun, time trial / survival minigame that gives each character a unique setup with different attacks and weapons. Speaking of which, while playing as Ada in her scenarios, it does feel like separate content. This isn't just Leon's game with a different character skin. But back to the main game, and yeah, it does hold up extremely well 15 years later. Even more so if you're playing the HD remastered version. They swapped out the bio and chemical weapon storylines for the parasite and mind control plot, but still managed to wiggle some Umbrella talk within the game. To this day, fans are still torn on the changes, but in hindsight, I feel like they were a bit necessary. If they released another Zombie Outbreak, Umbrella's still being a douchebag to the rest of the world game, then they really ran the risk of the franchise growing stale. After parts 1, 2, 3, Code Veronica, the remake, and Zero, not including all the non-main timeline games, it was time to just try something different, but they nailed it here. Not to mention that the lower than expected sales on the GameCube titles likely further pressured Capcom into making changes. Sure, it also pushed the series in the direction of 5 and 6, but they came back around with 2 fantastic games in 7 and the remake of 2. Looking back, so what if 6 wasn't good? They were due for a flop in the mainline series, and more importantly, listen to fans' criticisms. You do have to give Capcom some credit there. Believe it or not, Resident Evil 5 and 6 are the 2 best-selling titles in the franchise. Capcom easily could have just looked at that and kept trucking along like most companies would, but instead took what the fans wanted to heart and shifted the tone back to its survival horror roots. One of the major changes that was made in 4 really changed gaming in general, and that's the third-person over-the-shoulder camera. This was then used by everything from titles like Gears of War and Dead Space, and still through recent non-shooter games like Hellblade. To this day, there are still butthurt fans mad that they took away the fixed angles and tank controls, but it was a change that kinda needed to happen. I've seen mods of people using the fixed angle, and yeah, it works in some spots, but when the game gets hectic or you need to aim at specific spots on enemies, which is a lot of the game, it just doesn't work. And though they aren't tank controls in the fixed camera angle sense that we know them, this game does still kind of use tank controls. Okay, it's more of a halfway point, because you can move the camera a little, but Leon still moves like a tank. He can't go side to side or strafe, can't move while aiming, pulling back on the stick doesn't make him turn around unless you're using the quick turn, and if you try to turn around without the quick turn, you're gonna have to run in a small half circle. It doesn't look like your normal tank control game, but they are updated tank controls. That said, the controls in general didn't age perfectly. Because you don't have full control of the camera, it can take some getting used to again. It's a little hard to explain, but go from playing Resident Evil 4 to popping in 7 or the remake of 2 or vice versa, and you'll see exactly what I mean. Another change that has gotten an extremely bad name that Resident Evil 4 popularized was the QuickTime events. As far as I know, the Shenmue series kind of invented them, but despite being great games, they never really caught on with audiences. As a result, people tend to blame Resident Evil 4 for the burst of QTEs that flooded games afterwards. Now, the QuickTime events are all over the place, but they never really bothered me. They wanted to portray Leon as a super agent action star, and the button prompts added elements that gameplay simply couldn't do at the time. It's not like they're using these button prompts to replace full playable sections. The developers also wanted to implement ways to keep players fully invested at all times the game was on, even during cutscenes and dialogue. I guess it's really just personal opinion. I mean, at least half the QuickTime events could have just been cutscenes, but they do keep the gameplay from getting tedious. It's not like they're hard to win or really challenging that they ruin the game. Playing through the last time before making this, I actually died twice from not mashing quick enough, but I'll be honest, I really wasn't trying too hard. You barely have to button mash to progress, and the button combinations don't change throughout the game. It's really not that different than the entire gameplay of, say, Until Dawn, and that's an awesome horror game. But I also enjoyed games like Life is Strange and Firewatch, so maybe I'm just more forgiving of the QuickTime event controls than most players. The only times they really got on my nerves was during boss fights. With the increased pace of combat, most bosses have strong attacks that you can dodge during the fight. There are times I wasted ammo because some of the dodge prompts go hand in hand with the shooting controls. It can be annoying, but it's not an overly huge problem. Oh yeah, and regardless of what the internet says now, I distinctly remember people thinking the QuickTime event boss fight with Krauser was cool when the game came out. Might not have aged well, but a lot of people did like it because, at the time, it was something different. As a whole, the QuickTime events don't ruin the game by any means, but they do feel pretty gimmicky by today's standard. Speaking of boss fights, this game might have the best set of boss fights of the franchise. Not saying everyone is amazing, but as a whole, they're really satisfying. You can tell they tried really hard to make each and every boss feel different, and they even slipped in a few gimmicky ways to defeat them if you couldn't spare the ammo. Del Lago sees you being pulled from behind and focused on using harpoons. El Gigante is a bullet sponge, but can be exploited with simple flash grenades. After the first fight, you can then try to drop a boulder on him, or straight up melt one later on. Mendez has two forms, and they actually both do different things rather than simply make him look more gross. Verdugo takes a ton of ammo, or you can run and dodge while cheesing the freeze canisters that are spread through the hallways. Oddly enough, with him, the TMP seems way more effective than using shotguns or magnums. Salazar, I'll give him an A for effort because apparently I'm in the minority, but I hate this damn fight. It's more tedious than hard and more annoying than fun. His fight is one of the few times in the game that I really start to get bothered by the QuickTime dodges because they just happen so damn frequently. But after that we get the Krauser straight up QuickTime fight, which that doesn't bother me, and is followed up by U3, or IT, as Sadler calls it. By itself, U3 is a pretty generic Resident Evil boss, so they put the cable car hanging thing in there. It doesn't feel as cheap as it should, and it does ramp up the tension when you're trying to escape and open the doors at the same time. After you make it across, then it turns into the generic boss fight, but it's pretty cool before that. Next up, you get your lengthy, real final battle with Krauser, and it gave players fits. That is until people started to notice you can just do this. Unfortunately, Sadler is a bit of a lame final boss. It's still fun, and they added the whole dropping platform ladders to add stress, but it's your usual see different color eye, shoot different color eye, see bigger eye, kill bigger eye Resident Evil boss. Peppered between those are also the mini bosses. Chainsaw enemies became a lasting image of the game, but haven't aged as well. They do definitely add some panic to their encounters though, and kept your head on a swivel when you heard them. Garradors force you to slow down the pace, and I've already covered how awesome, and I guess in return shitty, the regenerators are. The JJ enemies, or the dudes with the big chain guns, are kinda lame too though. They get to be more annoying the more they show up. Whereas other Resident Evil games have had complaints of repetitive enemies, you won't find any shortage of enemy variants here. As a result of trying different gameplay elements and a ton of different enemies with different ways to kill them, it really helps the pacing of this game. Another big help is the fact that this is a very linear game, even though it doesn't really feel like it. You won't be running all over Raccoon City and its buildings, backtracking in this one. Leon just keeps pushing forward, and the constantly changing environments also keep the player from knowing what's coming next. When the village Ganados run the risk of becoming stale, they throw in things like the defend the fort battle with Luis or the minecart segment to kinda trick the player into thinking they aren't fighting the same enemies over and over again. They also break up monotony with the weapons in Leon's arsenal. You've still got your Resident Evil / action game mainstays like your handgun, machine gun, shotgun, magnum, and so on, but what they really changed up was the number of those weapons you can buy. That's right, in the middle of all this, you get to buy weapons from a merchant who's clearly got Plaga eyes and has no explanation as to what his deal is or why he's everywhere. Again, it's Resident Evil 4, so you fucking accept it. Anyway, you get 5 handguns, 2 magnums, a mine thrower, 3 shotguns, 2 rifles with different scopes, a machine gun, and 3 different types of grenades. All these can be upgraded over and over again as well, not to mention all the unlockable weapons that make Leon all but unbeatable. It's a smart, really easy way to increase the replayability within the game. Now for me, this is one of the things that makes this game great, and it seems like fans are pretty divided on it. And that's how goddamn cheesy this game is. Some people think they did it on purpose, and others think it was a complete accident and they just didn't know how to write American action heroes. It's probably a little bit of both, but holy shit does it work here. Because this game is so over the top gameplay wise, it works perfectly with how much of a dork Leon is, and that's really what he is. He's not smooth or cool at all, unless he's killing something. Those are the only times Leon comes off as cool, when he's killing shit. They succeeded in portraying him as a badass secret agent action hero, but failed spectacularly at making him cool. Part of what makes me think they had to have at least done some of it on purpose is how bad the other characters' interactions are too. Sadler is more reserved, but really tries some terrible puns, and Salazar's character is about as ridiculous as his own giant robotic statue attacking you is. Luis calls Ashley's tits ballistic missiles or something like that upon meeting her, and even Chopper Mike tries to get in on the quips for the 10 minutes he's alive. Resident Evil was never known for having good scripts, but this is just too bad for a paid professional team to write and take 100% seriously. But again, this entire game is so over the top that the horrible dialogue just blends perfectly into the game. There's no damn way this wasn't at least meant to have some tongue-in-cheek moments. But with that said, if you aren't paying attention to the words that are coming out of their mouths, the actual voice acting is pretty damn good for 2005. Oh, and don't worry, they keep the Resident Evil trend of overly caring for and screaming out names of characters they just met.
No!
Ada! Ashley! Leon! Sadler! Louis!
I wasn't really sure where to put this, so I'll just throw it out in its own section. What's the worst part of any game? Most people will say water levels and escort missions. Well, about a third of this game is an escort mission and doesn't really feel like it. Ashley's AI actually works very well within the game. She gets out of the way quickly when you need to shoot stuff around her and doesn't get lost in the shuffle during fights. This game is so good that they even made people not care about a huge chunk of it escorting Ashley around. The biggest complaint? Her damn voice. Not even dragging her around. In all seriousness, creating a fun escort game is arguably one of Resident Evil 4's biggest achievements. Now, it's not all perfect though. Not having a quick draw mechanic for changing weapons feels really outdated. But that slight, let me open up the inventory and change the shotgun again, makes blowing dudes' heads off oddly more satisfying, even if it does take longer. Also, you're going to take some cheap hits because Leon will aim in the complete opposite direction he's facing sometimes. When you're surrounded and trying to shoot quickly, it can be extremely frustrating. For as innovative as the game is, the enemy AI is really terrible by today's standards. A lot of the time, they'll just stand around waiting to get shot while staring directly at Leon. Also, you can usually find a place to funnel enemies or bait them into killing them one by one to save ammo. On the same note, you're programmed pretty early on to use the knife and melee attacks whenever possible. Sure, it's strategic I guess, but it slows down what's supposed to be a fast-paced, half-action, half-horror game. Which brings me into the biggest drawback. This game isn't really a horror game. It has horror elements, but the actual scares tend to come from an enemy you lost track of attacking you from off camera. The Garrador enemies are more tense than scary, and the dogs suck, but it's way more jump scare than actual scary, and those two enemies can become not really scary at all by just walking. The regenerator section is genuinely creepy, but that's about it. It's the drawback of turning Leon into an action hero. You relate to his run and gun, nothing phases him, blow enemies away by any means necessary character, and in return feel more invincible as a player. It's also kind of a double-edged sword though. While fans of the previous titles were let down by the action-heavy style, not everyone picking this game up was looking for a terrifying experience. Resident Evil purists can still enjoy the game, but definitely don't like it quite as much as casual gamers or fans who are new to the series. This one closer resembles the Resident Evil movie franchise than it does the prior Resident Evil games. With all that said, this game was considered still kinda scary upon its release. By today's standards, it's just an action game with zombie-ish enemies. The release of games 5 and 6, along with the continued growth and bastardizing of the film franchise, has given 4 more of a bad name over the years than it did upon its initial release. When all is said and done, this is just a really, really fun game. The plot is weak, Umbrella was unceremoniously cast aside, the script is laughably bad, and the most likable character is the Merchant. But really think about it. When has Resident Evil really had great characters prior to this? The Los Illuminados and the Plagas aren't that much different than Umbrella was with the TNG viruses. It's not like you ever needed a master's in physics to figure out puzzles before 4 came out either. Resident Evil has always been about the outstanding gameplay, and everything else is just a bonus. With developers afraid the series was getting stale, they tried something new. Sure, that alienated some hardcore fans, but in general, almost everyone was happy with this release. Resident Evil veterans tend to still say 2 is the best, but overall really liked the game. Players new to the franchise loved it, and tend to view the game even more fondly than the longtime fans. Now, isn't that what any film studio, band, or gaming company would hope to achieve? Capcom managed to keep their current fan base happy while also branching out to grab literally millions of new fans. Whatever followed after this is what it is, but that doesn't take away from the fact that Resident Evil 4 is universally recognized as a great game, regardless of what genre you want to say it belongs to. But one of the best games ever, though? It depends on who you ask. If it's me you're asking, then it's definitely up there, and it's still a great experience even now, despite its age. Well, that's all I've got for this one, and as usual, if you made it this far, thanks for watching, and I really do hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, see you guys.